So welcome back. For this segment, we'll be looking at psychotherapy through the lens of interpersonal neurobiology. And I want to again thank you for inviting me to come here and join you, and thank the ICD and NAVA for organizing this, this really wonderful opportunity. Alfred, thank you for your hosting as well. And we're going to dive deeply into the realm building on everything we just spoke about. So as we go, if there are points of information after each of the domains of integration we'll be speaking about now, we won't have a full discussion because we'll have that on Tuesday. But if you have anything that's just puzzling you, and it's a very brief informational question, I'm happy to entertain those as we go through each domain. So to highlight the basic issues we're going to dive into, the working proposal that's now been around since 1992 is the idea that we can offer a working definition of the mind as an embodied and relational, self-organizing emergent process that regulates energy and information flow. What that definition does for us in mental health is it gives us an opportunity to say, how is self-organization optimally regulating energy and information flow? And we saw that you can make the proposal that integration is the way to achieve optimal self-organization. And we saw that integration is defined as the linkage of differentiated parts of the system. So let's go through each aspect of that definition before we get into the domains of integration to make sure we're understanding its implications. The first word is embodied. What this means is that we as mental health professionals must know about the body, including the body's nervous system, which includes the brain. But it's also helpful to know about the digestive system and the immune system. It's helpful to know about the musculoskeletal system. We live fully embodied lives. We don't just have the body to transport the head around like this, even though some people live like that. So, for example, children in schools who are just sitting all day and not living in their bodies, as happens in the United States at least, we've cut out the physical activity parts of their day, their recess, their physical education, thinking it's not important. We are embodied beings, so we need to realize that. Neuroscience offers us incredibly powerful insights into the mechanisms by which energy and information flow through one part of the system of the mind, the body. So we as mental health professionals should keep current with what's happening in neuroscience, but the fact is neuroscience is a very rigorous discipline that itself has many disciplines, and the amount of publications that are coming out are hard for even one of those specific disciplines like affective neuroscience or cognitive neuroscience or social neuroscience. It's hard to keep up even one small part, let alone the big picture that include things like the epigenetic control of genes that regulate the way genes express themselves to alter neuroplasticity. That's also part of neuroscience. So it can be overwhelming. So the reason that I founded the Norton series for interpersonal neurobiology, where we have these 36 textbooks, is to translate those publications for us in mental health, because it's overwhelming if you get into the science. The other thing that's true about the science, and I don't know how, Nava, you feel about this, but it's hard to actually see the relevance for what you do in therapy when you read the straight science. As a clinician and scientist, you can see it, but then even articulating it, how do you apply it in practice, is very difficult. So that's what we're going to do for now and the remainder of our workshop together, today and on Tuesday. So embodied means we as mental health professionals need to know biology. We need to know about living systems, including the bodies we live in. Relational, what does that mean? Because we're saying it's embodied and relational. Relational means what happens between two people or among many people. We live in what's called a context, a social context. So in science, you would say that we, human beings, are embedded in a social surround. We saw how much of the brain with the default mode is at work, not only thinking about the self, but also thinking about others. We are very social creatures. I ran a think tank once for a number of scientists to ask the question, how do we know we have a mind? That was the question. And we had a lot of different people there. Jean Desity was there, who does a lot of work on empathy. Marco Iacoboni was the first person to study mirror neurons in human beings. He was there. A number of other people from anthropology, from neuroscience. On the morning that the results came out from Marco Iacoboni's first study inside the skull of a living human being, where he got permission from this neurosurgery patient to impale neurons, because that's the way you have to really measure them, in a living human being. The results came out that about a third of the neurons that were essentially randomly impaired in certain areas, a third of them had mirror properties, suggesting they were fundamental to the deep, before cognition way we actually resonate with other people. A third. Marco was blown away. And we were all very excited because what it means is our neural architecture is fundamentally social. And just to do a brief aside about the relationality of it all, the way, and I don't want to shock anyone, but the way development happens is a sperm and egg get together, just to remind you, and two half complements of DNA become one. It's a pretty big moment, and the conceptus, the single cell, ultimately is going to divide and become 2, and then 4, and then 8, and then 16, and 32, on and on, 64, 128, 256, bigger and bigger until there comes a time when this glob of cells does something very special, and it differentiates at the simplest level. Some are on the outside of this glob, and some are now on the inside. That's a big moment. And this glob continues to grow and grow and expand. And that outer layer, does anyone know what it's called? The ectoderm. It's going to become the skin, right? And the skin, in many ways, is the interface of the inside of the body and the outside world, right? So here's the reason I'm bringing this up. This is not the hand model, it's a different version, but make your hands go like this. This is the glob of cells. And now push it so that the fingernails start to move inward and the knuckles begin to kiss each other like that and go all the way in. Now you see where your fingernails now are? See that? Now let's reverse that whole process, bring it back up. Start like with the glob, okay? The fingernails are where the outer layer is, right? Now push it in like that. And you notice, see how it's inside? That's the origin of the neural tube. Basically, the nervous system is a sophisticated form of skin cell. And the reason I bring that up from a philosophical point of view is that just like the skin is the interface of the inner and the outer, the nervous system is the interface of the inner and the outer. That's its job. Maintain internal homeostasis, maintain relational equilibrium with the world around you. For even little creatures with nervous systems. We are very sophisticated social beings, so we have a very sophisticated social nervous system. To think of the brain outside of its social context, in some ways, and if you read a book called The Mind in Context, doesn't make any sense. The brain is profoundly social. And that's a whole different way we can go in the talk, but I just want to say that so that when we're talking about the relational part of the definition, it's a natural part, even if you just stick to the brain. Nothing we are saying discards the profound contributions of neuroscience. It just builds on them. It doesn't take away from it, it expands it. So our view in mental health is that the mind, and in Hebrew, I don't think this would limit itself to spirit or soul, but maybe, because in French they also don't have a word for mind. So it's interesting why Hebrew would not have that term. And I'm open to discussing of getting rid of the term, but what would the term be for your inner essence, the felt experience of being alive in Hebrew? So you could say consciousness, and some people would say subjective experience is the felt texture of conscious life, but we want something that includes consciousness and non-conscious processing. Of course, Freud talked about non-conscious. What's that? Well, this won't be a linguistic lesson. I just want you to think about it. In English, we do have this term mind, so never mind about that. But the reason I want to bring it up is because when we talk about this self-organizing process, it doesn't feel natural to anybody that I've encountered to have both an embodied, that is, neurophysiological process and a relational process talked about in the same sentence. When I was teaching in Poland, this faculty member came up and yelled at me. He said, "You can't talk about them even in the same lecture. They're just not the same thing." And that's why I wrote The Developing Mind, was for him. Because I think they are. We are not making the mind separate from the brain, like Descartes did. We're not doing that. We are saying there are three aspects of one reality. The reality is energy and information flow. It happens within you. That's the embodied brain part. It happens between you and the environment. That's the relational part, especially the social environment. And we are saying that one aspect of mind is the complex property called emergence. We're going to call it what in philosophy we would call a prime. A prime means something that's not reducible. So the mind, I'm suggesting, you cannot be reduced to brain activity, and it can't be reduced to relational activity. It's an emergent property of both. It's energy and information flow that's happening within us and between us, and it's a particular aspect of emergence is self-organization. Maybe consciousness is a different aspect of emergence. We'll talk about that in a moment. Okay, so we've said it's an embodied and relational process. It's about energy and information flow. So if you ask what it is, it's an emergent property of the complex system of energy and information flow. And just to underscore this, that flow is not limited to your skull. Show me one piece of scientific data that tells you that energy and information streaming through the neurons in your head that you see with a scanner is limited to the head. There is none. So it's at least fully embodied, but then show me one bit of evidence that shows that energy information flow is limited to your skin. It's not. So this is why it may not be natural or feel right, but in fact, from a scientific point of view, energy and information flow as the unit is not bounded by the skin. Okay, so we're saying it's a self-organizing process that's emerging from energy and information flow, and this self-organizing process has a function. It regulates energy and information flow. Now, when you see the word regulation, the first thing you can think about is that regulation as a process has a definition, and the simplest way of defining regulation is it has two parts, and these become extremely relevant for our work as therapists. So when a client or patient comes to see me, and I'm thinking about how to change the way they regulate energy and information flow, I think about these two things. Number one, monitoring. Monitoring means sensing or observing something. Number two is modifying that thing, or shaping that thing, or transforming that thing. So in short, you got to see it to shape it. You got to be able to track it and then transform it. This monitoring and modifying duo of regulation is true of any kind of regulation, regulating attention, regulating emotion, regulating memory, anything. All those things of self-regulation we talked about require monitoring and modifying. And here's the amazing thing. You as a therapist, when you do therapy tomorrow or do therapy on Wednesday, you can come to your clients with a whole different perspective that your job is to teach them to monitor with more stability so they see with more depth, detail, and clarity. What are they going to see? Energy and information flow. Where are they going to see it? 2 places. You tell me which 2. Within, inside, and between. So literally, your job is, as a teacher, as a psychotherapist, you're going to teach them to monitor with more stability so they see with more focus, so they get more clarity, more detail, more depth. It's like a lens. I call it a Mindsight lens. When it's out of focus, and if I were going with you to the park and we had this lens that was jumping around like that, and we watched the video, what would it look like? It'd be blurry, exactly. It'd be blurry. And how would you edit a blurry video? You couldn't. So you can't modify something that you can't see clearly. So I know it sounds ridiculously simple, but at our Mindful Awareness Research Center, which I helped co-found at UCLA, we thought this way and we said, hey, what if we take people with attention challenges, teach them to monitor energy information flow and then modify it in ways that might strengthen attention? Let's see what happens. We got the results. We took the results to our colleagues who were pharmaceutical researchers, and they said, oh my God, you got better results than any medication ever seen. What was the medication and what was your dose? And we said, take away the C and put a T. And they said, what? They say, we taught these people to meditate. We didn't give them any medication. Now, you would think that with attention deficit disorder and contemplative practices, which for 2,600 years had been teaching people how to strengthen attention, some would have thought to put it together, but no one had. It's quite, I mean, it's, when you just think simply, you get simple things happening. It's kind of amazing. So our primary researcher, Lydia Zlowska, she wrote a book called The Mindful Prescription for ADHD, which teaches you the steps that we did. It was an open study, so of course no pharmaceutical companies fund us. No one's willing to fund a study like that because no one makes money. When you teach people to practice mindfulness, for example, nobody makes money because it just empowers the people. It doesn't make anyone fund money, you know, so it's, you don't see a lot of research on that. Anyway, so you have to understand the politics and economics that's behind what goes on in a lot of universities. So the issue there is that when you think about monitoring and modifying, what you're doing is you're saying, I understand the mind is a regulatory process. I'm going to teach this person, in this case it was a research study, I'm going to teach these people how to monitor with more stability and modify how toward integration. And that's the whole model. Period. So then you say, well, what are the ways of doing integration? That's what we're going to do now. So to repeat, we're saying that the mind is an embodied and relational process. It's a self-organizing emergent process. And what's that process doing? It's regulating, that is monitoring and modifying, energy and information flow where? Within you and between you. Any questions about that? Does that make sense? Yes? No? Yes? Okay. Yes. You're very confused. Where are you? Raise your hand when you're speaking so I can see you. Yes, please. I'm going to repeat so everyone can hear. It sounds so easy. Have your patient learn to see it and modify it, yeah. Yeah, so good, excellent. So the question is, if it's self-organizing, how can you intentionally influence self-organization, right? And that's confusing. So this is exactly the fundamental issue. So you are basically empowering the person's consciousness, which in every form of therapy I could find, of the 450 therapies there are, especially the ones that have been empirically proven, but even the ones that haven't been empirically studied that we kind of know work, they just haven't been studied yet, they all involve consciousness. So consciousness invites choice and change. And so you're able to literally to introduce the capacity of the mind with consciousness to intentionally change the way self-organization is happening. And that's because we live in bodies and we live in social worlds. So let me give you an example of that. And as we go through, for example, the integration of consciousness, which is our first domain, I think it'll highlight exactly what we're talking about to clarify it. But your confusion is really, I'm sorry to say great, but it's really pointing out that you're really tracking this whole issue. If self-organization doesn't have a conductor, it doesn't have an external conductor, but it has the opportunity for change. If it didn't, there'd be actually no point in me giving you this talk. Because we'd say, oh, well, it is what it is, que sera, too bad, your life is in trouble. Right? But this just isn't the case. Now, to begin with, in terms of the embodied part, and we'll go through these domains, here's the balancing act that may begin to help. Complex systems have what are called internal constraints and external constraints that alter the probability paths they go through. And you saw some of that in Nava's slides. You can alter those valleys intentionally. So you may not be able to control it, like, you know, to make it fixed, but you can absolutely alter that in ways that we're going to explore in a lot of detail now. So when you think about complex systems, you're really always talking about probabilities, not absolute certainties. Right? So as a therapist, we need to work with that probability issue about the mind. So that's the first thing. The second thing, when we look at what you're really doing as a therapist, is you're altering these constraints as best you can. So let's say I'm working with a child who has a very difficult situation at home. I'm a child psychiatrist, so I work with kids. A very difficult situation at home. There's nothing I can do if that child's being abused to really help that child unless I change the family system that child's in. So I can't be thinking, oh, this is just an anxiety disorder, I'm going to give this kid a pill, and the kid continues to be abused. I've got to be someone who works with the mind of this child, which includes the family system. You see? So I've got to find out where is impaired integration going on in this system, and I'm going to take action, because it's just a little kid, to actually alter the family system. Sometimes that means removing a child from a family. Now, let's say this is now not a kid, but let's say it's a 25-year-old who was abused as a kid, but she doesn't live with her family anymore. Now I know that from neuroplasticity, her experiences in her childhood, from Marty Teich's work, have changed the integrated nature of her brain. Depending on the timing of the abuse, she'll have impairments to hippocampal development in the limbic area of the brain. She'll have impairments to her corpus callosum that allows the left and right to work well together. And she will have, or she may have, prefrontal impairments. Now, 4 ways we change a brain through experience, whether it's traumatic or not traumatic, 4 ways you change a brain, and we should just make sure we realize them, because everything we're about to talk about now in terms of these domains of integration ultimately mean that you as a therapist are going to be stimulating neuronal activation and growth. Now that spells the English word snag, which I know in Hebrew it's hard to cross over acronyms, but just a way of remembering it. The way the brain changes ultimately is neural firing, which is 2 neurons communicate with each other through an action potential of basically an electric charge going down. There's a release of a chemical, the neurotransmitter at the end, and the other is activated. So when there's neural firing, there's the possibility, not an absolute certainty, but there's a possibility that the connections between these 2 neurons in a whole circuit among the neurons that are activated will change. How can they change? Number 1, you have synapse modulation in all sorts of ways. So you can either grow new synapses or strengthen or weaken the synapses that are there, so synapse modulation. You can take neural stem cells that at least are in the hippocampus, in the dentate gyrus of the hippocampus, and you can actually stimulate them to grow over an 8-week period into fully mature neurons. So neurogenesis continues throughout adulthood in the hippocampus. That's number 2, neurogenesis. Number 3, you can lay down myelin. Myelin is laid down by the support of glial cells that wrap this sheath around connected neurons. And essentially, the 2 things that myelin does is it makes the action potential go 100 times faster, and it makes the resting period after a neuron fires 30 times shorter. So 30 times 100 is 3,000. So when you've laid down myelin, your circuitry is not only 3,000 times faster, even more importantly, the two big things about the brain are timing of firing and coordination of that firing. So when you're myelinated, you can become more coordinated. What's that? Physically, you can physically, right, these are physical changes in the brain. So we've said you can change synapses, you can grow new neurons, you can lay down myelin. The fourth way you change your brain in psychotherapy, I'm suggesting to you, as well as development, is you can change this is theoretical, but this happens in regular development, so we're hypothesizing it's going to happen in psychotherapy. You can change the molecules that are not DNA that sit on top of DNA. So these are methyl groups and histones that sit on top of the DNA, which comprises your genes. These are like librarians in a library. They control which books are going to be read. In this case, the epigenetic molecules control which genes will be expressed and how. The reason that's important for neuroplasticity is because the only way the neural firing can change synapses, grow new neurons, or lay down myelin is by the activation of genes. So if you're the librarian of that gene library, you have a really important role. So here's the crucial thing all therapists need to know from science in general and neuroplasticity in particular. Number one, and this is new discoveries in the last like 12 years. Number one, experience not only changes synapses, changes neuronal growth, changes myelin, it also changes epigenetic controls. Activation of genes changes the regulation of gene expression. The activation of neurons, neural firing, changes the epigenetic regulation. So it not only expresses genes, it changes the way they're regulated. And the second thing that I'm going to say, which is very painful to say here in Israel, it's painful to say anywhere, depending on the timing of a traumatic experience, but we inherit the epigenetic changes of our grandparents. In other words, let me give you an example of my grandmother. My grandmother was in the womb. She was in her mother's uterus, and at that time, her father was murdered in a pogrom by Cossacks. Research suggests that when the female baby is in the womb at the time her ovaries are developing, that the stress that her mother experiences, in this case of her father being murdered, is going to affect that mother's baby's ovaries, her eggs. So that when my grandmother is born, there will be an adaptive response for her to be hypervigilant for danger, to be always alert to dangerous things that could happen. With that being in her ovaries, then she gives birth to my father, who also had that, who gives birth to me, and I have that. And you can trace this, for example, to Holocaust survivors. That gets passed generation to generation, not by what we experience interactively, but preliminary research, not just on Holocaust survivors, but also on, in Sweden. When you look at the timing of famine, if the female individual was in the womb at the time of a famine for her mother, she will pass on a likelihood of, or a higher likelihood of having diabetes. Because when there's a famine, you want to change your metabolism so you hold on to anything you eat, because there's hardly anything around. But if you do that when there's a lot of food around, you just become obese. And for males, the preliminary research suggests it's if you experience this trauma when your sperm are developing right before the onset of puberty. So it's a complicated set of studies. They're just coming out. There's an incredible documentary about the people who are leading this research. If you just go to BBC and put in epigenetic documentary or something, you'll come up with this free documentary you can watch. It's an incredible new finding for those of us. And in America, of course, we have a whole population of people whose grandparents were slaves. And no one's talking about that. But the issue is that as therapists, we need to know that the traumas of past generations are literally carried forward, as far as we can tell, in the epigenetic controls of areas that regulate the response to stress. So these aren't just like the color of your fingernails or something. This is about the very substance, the very areas of what the mind is about can be affected by the body you're born into, by things that your parents had no control over. So we just need to be aware of that. Yes? You know, I'm having a hippocampal naming moment. I can't remember. All you have to do is type in Google search, Google Scholar, and type in epigenetic regulation. There's a bunch of articles about this. So it's easy to find. I hope you all know how to do that. Google, and then you go to Google Scholar, and then you type in epigenetics, and you will have more than enough reading to do for the next couple of years or months. Rachel Yehuda has studied the Holocaust survivors in New York, and I can't remember the researchers in Sweden, but they had this 500-year record of these folks. Myself, I got to tell you, I was the psychiatrist who was working at the survivors of the Shoah Foundation, and we collected 55,000 interviews of survivors of the Holocaust. And my job was to support the interviewers and the coders who had to watch these 6 to 8 hour interviews, often of people who never spoke about what happened. And they themselves were becoming traumatized. So the issue that we'll talk about now, basically, is, you know, how do we as mental health professionals support ourselves, first of all, but support everyone around who's experiencing these kind of traumas directly with the uncertainty of things, let's say, that go on here, but go on everywhere. You know, but especially when you have this legacy of trauma in such recent history, you know, with the Holocaust and the formation of Israel, these issues, I would imagine, are very crucial to understanding how do you actually work with your own self-regulatory systems. So, in the Survivors of the Holocaust Foundation, everything I'm about to tell you about these areas of integration were useful for those people who were bearing witness to the trauma. And I'll just give you one thing so I don't forget it. There's an amazing study in a book called The Neurobiology of Empathy, and one of the co-editors is Jean Decety, D-E-C-E-T-Y, and I think it's the second article, and I can't remember the name of the author, but it's in that book. And basically what they did was this, and this is just a take-home lesson for all of us. And I'll just give you a teeny story. Close friends of mine's daughter became a social worker. She couldn't wait to become a therapist. Now she was in her internship, and she was ready to quit. So they talked to me about her, and I said, have her come talk to me. So she came and talked to me. I said, what's going on? She goes, I'm seeing these people in this clinic. I always wanted to be a therapist, but I'm burning out. I've been doing this for 5-6 months. I'm ready to quit. I said, well, tell me what you do. She goes, well, the person comes in, and I'm empathic with them, and I go home at the end of the day. I can't get them out of my minds. And I said, what do you mean you're empathic with them? What do you do? She goes, well, I do what any therapist who's empathic does. I said, well, what does that mean for you? She goes, they come in. I say, what's going on? Usually it's something about someone abusing them. And I'm empathic. I said, what does that mean? She goes, I think, what would that have been like if that were me? So I said, okay. And I said, how's that working for you? She goes, well, I'm ready to quit. So I said, do you know the study on the neurobiology of empathy? She goes, no, what's that? I said, 2 conditions, brain scans in both. One, you saw this horrific car accident, horrible, horrible car accident, very graphic. And the first condition is you say, imagine if that were you. And the second condition, other subjects, is imagine what it feels like to be that person in the photograph. In one condition, the brain fires off like nuts and completely shuts down. In the other condition, the brain fires off all the circuitry you saw, the default mode, and then the circuitry of compassion, of acting on behalf of others to reduce their suffering, gets activated, and the person stays balanced, basically, in the brain. Which condition was which? Over-identifying with someone, I said to my friend's daughter, can lead you to burnout, because there's no differentiation of you from the person. Integration is the basis of health, and you are not integrating. You are excessively identifying, so you're not differentiating enough. In our work, we have to be differentiated and link compassionately. You can imagine what it's like to be that person. You don't have to imagine what it's like for you to be that person. I saw her 6 months later at a family party. I said, how's it going? She goes, I'm like a different person. And that's what her parents had told me. They said, she's changed completely. She goes, I don't know how that little change changed everything, but it changed everything. And so the point here is that even if we know these things that happened to us in our past, in this case, she was just doing this one thing, but even if you know, like one of my dearest friends, her parents were both in Auschwitz, and knowing these issues about epigenetic changes that she likely inherited is very helpful. And I'm very hopeful that we as therapists will show, no one's shown this yet, that we may be able to reverse those epigenetic changes. We don't know that. We just don't know. It's such a new science, we don't know. But people who have been traumatized themselves or who are Holocaust survivor, family members feel helpless about this, and I actually feel very hopeful. Because this is a system that's designed to be changing. The whole nervous system is incredibly dynamic. And this comes to the question of what we can do. The issue is, how do you initiate changes that make deep integrative changes? This is the whole approach. So one thing, for example, that is a value of having mind be different from brain activity, maybe totally dependent on it, but different, differentiating those functions. Brain firing is ions flowing in and out of membranes and chemicals being released. The mind is the self-organizing process that includes subjective experience, which is not the same as brain firing, even if it depends completely on it. Now, I know that's not politically correct to say that, but I think it's true. And here's one reason it's very important. This simple statement: the mind can change the brain. I used to say that in the 90s, people thought I was out of my mind, even though they didn't define it. The mind can change the brain. If the mind were the brain, how could that work? Well, the fact is the mind can change the brain. Now, in the 90s, if you said it, it was heresy. Just like there was this whole localization theory about the brain. But in fact, we now know, and Norman Doidge, a colleague of mine, wrote a book called The Brain That Changes Itself. And if you haven't read it, it's really important to read. It shows that things we used to believe in neuroscience, like the localization theory, one function, one area of the brain, is just not true. The brain functions as a system. Same thing is true about neuroplasticity. The brain is constantly changing itself moment to moment. Right now, sitting in your seat, your brain, hopefully, if I'm doing my job right, is going to be changing. Okay, so let's go through these domains of integration, knowing that the mind can change the brain. Now, you say, well, what am I supposed to do as a therapist? Get a scalpel and get inside my patient's brain? No. Your job is to develop a relationship with your client so that you inspire them to rewire their brain. I'll have you consider that the only way long-lasting change happens in psychotherapy is if you change these systems. One of the parts of the system we must change is the brain. And luckily, the field of neuroplasticity has shown that you can change the brain at any age. So one patient in that Mindsight book you'll meet is a 92-year-old who never had been to therapy before, thought I was nuts to try to do therapy with him, and you'll see the details of how he changed. So much his wife called me of 65 years and asked if I had given her husband a brain transplant. And you could say, well, how did that process of change happen? So let's outline it now as we get into these domains. Energy and information flow. That's your friend. The way the mind changes a brain, or even changes a relationship, is energy and information flow. So here's another really weird thing I'm going to say. The mind uses the brain and relationships to create itself. People get so upset with that statement. They say, no, 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 you got it backwards. The brain is creating the mind. I'm telling you, the mind is using the brain. And just to emphasize this point, if you and I were watching TV, do you know the movie Forrest Gump? Okay, so let's say we decided, okay, we had enough of this lecture, let's watch TV tonight. We go into the room, we watch TV, we're watching Forrest Gump. Now, if you tell me that Forrest Gump, Tom Hanks, and his mom, Sally Field, are in that TV, I would say, well, of course they're in the TV, right? Where else would they be? And then we said, hey, let's get a screwdriver and undo this TV and find Tom in there and Sally. So we take apart the TV and we look and we look, all these wires are in there. There's no Tom and no Sally. Forrest Gump is not in the TV. That movie, script written, the actors doing their job, the story that's embedded in the energy and information flow is using the TV to manifest itself. What I'm going to suggest to you is that the mind uses the brain in the same way. The mind is using the brain and using our relationships to create itself. Now, I know that's really gets people mad, but the fact is, it's a real distinct possibility. Now, at least we can say, if you have a black and white TV, you're only going to see a black and white story. Sure. The way the story is expressed is going to absolutely be shaped. You get a bonk on the head, a tumor, a bullet, you have a stroke, you have some disease in the brain, absolutely, just like a black and white TV isn't the same as a color TV. You're going to shape the story, but the mind is using that brain to create itself. And the way it does that is it changes the brain activity by shifting energy and information flow, and amazingly, the brain structure can change too. We now know, and there are studies in the last 3 years that show, for example, that mindfulness training changes the brain within 24 hours of training. Just to give you a sample, mindfulness training increases the integration in the brain. It increases the integration of the default mode network. It also changes the immune system. This is just what you do with your mind, what you do with energy and information flow. It improves the immune system. It increases an enzyme called telomerase that repairs and maintains the ends of chromosomes. It actually has been now shown to change the epigenetic molecules that regulate gene expression in areas of the genes that control the inflammatory response. So let me repeat that. What you do with the energy and information flow of your mind changes brain structure, changes immune function, changes telomerase levels that maintain the ends of your chromosomes as they whittle away as you get older, and it changes the molecules, the histones and methyl groups that regulate gene expression to help prevent certain inflammatory diseases like certain diabetes and certain cancer. Now established. What you do with your mind changes the molecules of your body. You can say, that is too weird. And it is amazing, but it's not mysterious. Energy and information flow is a physical thing. We're not talking about some weird other domain of reality. When I say energy, I literally mean ions flowing in and out of membranes and chemicals. In a relationship, I'm talking about sound waves. I'm talking about photons bouncing off of bodies that let you see how a person is moving. This isn't like wacko stuff. This is physics. So, the domains of integration are all based on everything we just said. Your key is energy and information flow as a therapist. You need to know about the brain because you're going to help self-organization move that flow differently than the way it was moving before that person entered your office. If you weren't going to do it differently, why were they coming? If they were just coming to be your friend, they could see you at a restaurant. They're coming to change their brain, and they're coming to change their relationships. Those two things. And now you're going to know how to do it. So you say, well, if I'm not using a scalpel to get in their brain, what am I doing? Energy and information flow is regulated by a process that in cognitive science has a simple term. It's called attention. Attention is defined as that process which regulates energy and information flow. It's usually just information flow, but if you talk to information scientists, every form of information known is carried on energy patterns. So we'll say energy and information flow. That's attention. Where does that flow happen? It can happen in your nervous system, how you focus attention, let's say, on your bodily sensations, or it can happen in your relationships. So right now, if I say snow, you may be paying attention to the weather predictions for the next couple of days. But before I said snow, you probably weren't doing that. So relationally, we shape attention by our communication. If I say, which we may do in just a few moments, let's focus on the sensation of our breathing, that's a mental process of focusing attention. You also have the intention to focus on your breathing because we have a relationship. So you can begin this process then by realizing your job as a therapist is to align in a relationship that's filled with trust to help guide the attention of your client in new directions. So let me review with you these domains of integration just very briefly, and we'll get into them in a lot more depth on Tuesday. These are summarized in the book Mindsight, so if you want to read more. For yourself, if you want to develop these domains of integration, the book The Mindful Therapist is useful. A book to have alongside of it is called The Pocket Guide to Interpersonal Neurobiology, where it is this nonlinear book that helps you just explore all of these issues as you go through this other stuff. And then there's The Developing Mind, which is more of a science textbook that's used in graduate schools and undergraduate programs. So that's very dense. These other ones are more user-friendly. Okay, the first domain is called the domain of consciousness. And whenever you hear the word integration, you know it means the differentiation of something and then the linkage of those differentiated parts. So what could be differentiatable in consciousness? What is consciousness anyway? These are not easy questions. But we said that consciousness is a part of every psychotherapy known, so it's got to be important for us as mental health professionals. What is it? Okay, well, it's not so easy, but here's one way to think about it. Of course, there are many ways of thinking about it. If we say that consciousness is the same as awareness, just to use those terms together, when you're aware of something, you have a subjective experience of knowing. That's the simplest way of defining one aspect of consciousness. It's an experience of knowing. When you're aware, you know. You are conscious of me, you know I'm here. It's just knowing, something simple. But the other thing in consciousness that can be differentiated from knowing is the known. For example, the known of me being here and you being there, or the known of your body sitting in the chair and the feeling on your skin. There's all sorts of knowns. So for me, integration of consciousness means you are distinguishing the known from the knowing. And many of my patients couldn't do that. So if they got filled with a feeling, for example, it became their total identity. There was no separate knowing from the known of their despair about life, or if they were traumatized or just had a phobia or obsessive compulsive issues or whatever. Integration of consciousness is the place we start. So what I would do is I would bring people around this table in my office, which is shaped like a wheel. So if you draw on if you're drawing something, if you draw a center hub of this wheel and an outer rim of the wheel, that's a table in my office, I would walk patients around and I would say, okay, let's picture this. The hub is knowing, the rim is the known, and then there were these like things holding up the table, and I said, imagine that's a spoke of attention. Now, understand what we just did. We just distinguished attention, which is that process which regulates energy and information flow. It directs it, from awareness, which is the experience of knowing, which often but not always has a known. So we're going to move this spoke of attention around. So there are 4 segments of the rim. The first segment is your first 5 senses. What you hear, what you see, what you smell, what you taste, what you touch. That's the first segment of the rim, the outer world. The next segment of the rim, of the known on this rim, is the inner world of the body, which in science we call interoception, the perception of the interior of the body, different from what you feel on your skin. It's actually what's driven up the insula. So it allows you to actually develop an image of the interior of your body. What does that mean? Your muscles, your bones, throughout the whole body, your genitals, but I can go a little slower. I'm mindful of, you probably don't realize that they're throwing up time markers for me, but I will go slower, even though time does not exist. I'll make the nows unfold in less frequent series. And we're going to have time to go over this again, but if you think about the knowns, we've said there's the first 5 senses. That's the known, not the knowing, but the known. We're now going to a second segment of this outer rim of this wheel. The first one is the first 5 senses, so exterior perception, exteroception it's called. Then we go from exteroception to interoception, perception of the interior, which includes the muscles, the bones, input from the genitals, the intestines, everywhere from your lower intestines through your stomach to the interior of your throat, your lungs, and your heart, and that's just a sampling. And by the way, since we have this break, there's a wheel of awareness practice you can do, which I urge you all to do, before we meet again on Tuesday. We've had over 500,000 people download it from our website, and it's had some, well, I'll just leave it at that. You can do it and see what it's like for yourself. But it will describe to you all these things. So if you go to Dr. Dan Siegel, DrDanSiegel, drdansiegel.com, and then go to the resources tab, and then it'll say Mindsight resources or something like that, and then click on that, and then you'll get yourself to the Wheel of Awareness. For you, since this is kind of an advanced workshop, I would do the Wheel of Awareness practice, I think it's number 2. On there. It's got an advanced step. If you've never done any mindfulness at all before, just do number 1. But if you're up for a little adventure, do number 2. Okay, so this is interoception, and it'll walk you through that. Then you go to the third segment of the rim. What else can you have in your knowns besides the sensations from the interior of the body and from the outside world? Your thoughts and feelings, absolutely. So that's mental activities. Let's just call it that. Let's just name that. We have the first 5 senses. Science calls interoception the 6th sense. Let's just name this the 7th sense, just to keep the numbers in sequence. So this is your feelings, your thoughts, your memories, your hopes, your dreams, your narratives, your meanings, your longings, your desires. All that mental life is there and that known. And then you even have, I believe, a 4th segment of the rim, which is called, I call it the relational sense, or 8th sense. It's your sense of connection to other people and even the planet. It's one of the most underdeveloped senses that we have. So people and the planet. So let's review them. The first 5 senses, the 6th sense of the interior of the body, the 7th sense of mental activities like thoughts and feelings, memories, and then an 8th sense, our relational sense. When you do this Wheel of Awareness practice, what's fascinating about it is you systematically move the spoke around. Now, in terms of the question of how can self-organization be directed, because here what you're doing is you're bringing intention to not guarantee anything, but just to move the constraints. So here the intention sets up the pattern by which you're going to distinguish the known from the knowing, and then you systematically experience all the different knowns from each other by moving that spoke around. And in the advanced practice, you even bend the spoke of attention and focus attention straight into the experience of awareness. Now, I know I'm out of time. I have time. Oh, okay. Good. Oh, was that not right? Oh, I see. Oh, I was wondering what happened. So tell me the time I actually have. Oh my God, I was given a 5-minute warning about 15 minutes ago, so, wow. Okay, thank you. Thanks for the gift. Okay, so when you look at the frame this way, and I'm not going to say more about it. We'll see. I'd like you to experience it directly for yourself, because the mind is ultimately a subjective experience that you can experience yourself. So we'll go on from that. Integration of consciousness, our first domain, allows you to give yourself the flexibility of consciousness that is the gateway for the other 8 domains. So in terms of a starting place, doing work to teach people to literally monitor energy and information flow outside of themselves and within them, and then to modify that flow toward integration, is all embedded in this one practice. So if you didn't do any other practice yourself and wanted to experience what enhancing, monitoring, and modifying is, the wheel is a good example. Okay, so let's go to the second domain. The second domain, and these next 7 can be in any order, but we'll just do them for teaching purposes in this order, is called bilateral integration. And this bilateral, two-sided, bilateral. And this relates to the issue that you have 2 different sides of the brain, and this is a very controversial point. So my close friends who are card-carrying neuroscientists tell me that it is absolutely incorrect politically to say at a neuroscience meeting anything much about the difference between the left and right side of the brain. So that's a really interesting issue. However, if you read the 800-page book by Ian McGilchrist called The Master and His Emissary, which he took 25 years to write, you will see an extensive review of neuroscience literature, including the first 25 pages, which tries to understand why neuroscientists are not reviewing the last 100 years of neuroscience and how it actually has... Yeah, the book is called The Master and His Emissary. Emissary, E-M-I-S-S-A-R-Y. The author is Ian, I-A-I-N, and the last name is McGilchrist, which is M-C-G-I-L-C-H-R-I-S-T. Now, what Ian has shown in this book is that there is an extensive literature across various sciences supporting the statement that there is a distinct difference between the left cortex and the right cortex. If you look at the work of Colwyn Trevarthen, who studied with, who's the person who got the Nobel Prize for showing the difference between left and right hemisphere? What's that? Sperry. Right, Sperry, Roger Sperry. So Colwyn was a student of Roger Sperry, and what Colwyn studied was the difference between the left and right hemisphere in the developing child, the infant. What Roger Sperry did was study individuals with split brains. That is, they had intractable seizures. This was at Caltech. You had to cut the corpus callosum, and he could then study in ways now where Aaron Zeidel at UCLA studies without having corpus callosum cut, things that affirm what Roger Sperry found and got the Nobel Prize for, which was distinct differences between the left hemisphere. If you look at the work of Donald Tucker, you will find huge developmental differences between the left and right, and even architectural differences in the cortex of the left and right. So why you're not allowed to say this, I'm not a neuroscientist that's a card-carrying person that has to worry about it, but when this comes up, it's always, there's a lot of nervousness. So I don't understand that. Maybe Nava can tell us about it later, or Julio. The bottom line is this, and if you want the quick version of that 800-page book, there's an 11-minute video. So if you go to the RSA, T-H-E-R-S-A, so Royal Society of Arts, you'll see Ian's thing if you just type in thersa.org/the divided brain. You'll see an 11-minute video where Ian summarizes his book. Anyway, the bottom line is, for us as therapists, it's important to be very humble about the controversy in the field and realize there's a lot of fighting about it. However, it's worth taking the time, 11 minutes, to watch the video, but I even urge you to buy the book, because what you'll see is clear scientific evidence for the following statements that I've gone over and over with Ian about, so I feel comfortable saying it about it and writing about it. The right hemisphere and the left hemisphere have different influences in their development from the subcortical structures that Don Tucker has written beautifully about. So the bottom line is, before the baby is even born, there's the beginning of influences from the limbic area and the brainstem and other structures that provide different streams of energy and information flow up to the left versus the right. That's the first thing to say. So these differences are not cultural. That is, they aren't learned by the child growing up in a certain culture or other. They are distinct anatomic differences that can be seen early on. Secondly, the recursive property of development means these differences are going to make these two hemispheres start to interact with the areas below them in different ways. And then when they interact with the environment, there can be different ways in which each hemisphere develops. So when you look at the work of Thatcher out of Florida, you see, in fact, the right hemisphere is dominant in the first 2 years of life. Some people would say 3, but to be conservative, we'll say 2, in its activity and growth. So during the early attachment years, the right hemisphere is the dominant hemisphere in activity and growth. Now, this helps explain why the majority of interoceptive data from the interior of the body move upward to the right hemisphere. The right anterior insula is dominant over the left, and it's the right regions which represent bodily processes. So it may not be a surprise to you that it's very clear in the research that it's the right ventral areas of the prefrontal cortex that are more dominant in regulating emotion, not the left. In fact, the brain is kind of twisted, as someone gave it a twist. The right prefrontal area is much larger than the left. These are structural differences in the brain. So what this means for us is the following take-home lesson. When we understand the difference between left and right, and that energy and information flow streams through both, and just like if you had a black and white TV or a color TV, this is now taking all the scientific evidence at hand. Here's a summary that makes it simple to remember, but obviously very complex in the science. But this is just for us as clinicians. The right develops earlier, whereas the left develops later. I'm going to contrast the two. The left has a tendency for linear processing. There's a second L, whereas the right tends to be holistic. It tends to see things in their larger context. The left is dominant, not exclusive, but dominant for linguistic language, whereas the right is dominant for nonverbal communication, both in the perceiving of nonverbal signals and the sending of them. What are nonverbal signals? Let's do it together. Eye contact. Please say it with me. Facial expressions. Tone of voice. Gestures. Posture. Timing. And intensity. Those are perceived and sent primarily by the right hemisphere. Okay, that's nonverbal. The left, in addition to being later, linguistic, and linear, has a kind of logic to it. The kind of logic is called syllogistic reasoning. So reasoning happens throughout the whole nervous system, but this kind of reasoning is looking for cause-effect relationships. How do you know when a young child has his or her left brain come online? What do they say that lets you know? Exactly. They say why. The left hemisphere wants to know why. Why do we know that? Because it's looking for cause-effect relationships. That's syllogistic reasoning. The right doesn't do that. The left is dominant for that. Why? That's the way it's structured. We won't get into that right now. Then finally, one of my patients made me put this other L on the list, which he said I had left out. The left loves being literal. and actually loves making lists. The right, in contrast, is metaphoric, loves poetry, loves words with multiple meanings. The right sees contexts, whereas the left sees the text. The right is all about the spirit of the law, whereas the left is the literal nature of the law. The right, amazingly, is dominant for, and this blew my students away when they saw this, autobiographical memory is dominant on the right side. Both contribute in various ways to autobiographical narrative, but literal representations of lived experience is dominant on the right. So, for example, the right hippocampus plays a more active role in autobiographical memory than the left. And then awareness of the body is a right dominant process. Now, notice I keep on saying dominant, so it's not absolute this or that. However, bilateral integration means you respect differences and you promote linkages. Especially if you're doing couples therapy, this becomes crucial, because if you are trying to communicate with another person's right hemisphere using your left, it will not work. And it's a simple fix to get both people in touch with the energy and information flow feeling of the left hemisphere versus the right, and then have them communicate right to right or left to left. It's a very basic way of doing bilateral integration. Okay, so that has a whole methodology to it where you differentiate the two and then link them. Then there's vertical integration, which is basically awareness of the interior of the body. It allows you to actually realize that intuition and all sorts of very important somatic states arise and move upward, and they may not be logical, but they're incredibly important for reasoning. Yes. So that's a part of vertical integration, whereas if you've been sexually abused, for example, many people cut themselves off from feeling their bodies, and that impaired integration leads to chaos or rigidity. So part of the work of vertical integration is have them honor the differences and promote linkages, awareness of what's below. Memory integration involves different layers of memory. At a very simple level, there's implicit memory, which gets embedded early in life and requires the hippocampus to be integrated into what are called explicit forms of factual memory and autobiographical memory. And in many ways, trauma can be seen at the least as an impairment of the hippocampus to integrate implicit memory into its explicit forms. And when that happens, unfortunately, pure implicit memory is not tagged with a sense of remembering. So rather than take these last 3 minutes and just rush through the other domains, let me just say this about the overall approach, because otherwise I think it'll be just too rushed. Integration, which will continue on Tuesday, as your foundation as a therapist, allows you basically to do the following things: to differentiate the element of that domain and then develop that. So, for example, in bilateral integration, you'll see the case of Stuart, the 92-year-old, who, because of attachment reasons, the hypothesis is he had impaired bilateral integration. And then what we had to do was realize his right hemisphere was extremely underdeveloped and his left was extremely hyperdeveloped. He was an attorney who was really well known for how logical and powerful his reasoning was in that kind of cause-effect way. So in psychotherapy, he felt unclear about what he was supposed to be doing. So I had to access his right hemisphere. Now, how would I focus attention to access his right hemisphere? So if you look at the list of what I said, you would work on nonverbal communication, which I did with him, having him become aware of his body, which is a right hemisphere dominant process, having him name emotions ultimately to bring left and right together, and to have a shared experience with him. And as he did this, even gaining access to autobiographical memory, not from when he was 90 years ago, a little kid, but what he did that morning. Developing a sense of himself in time is what autobiographical memory is. He started changing in profound ways that you can read about in that Mindsight book, the chapter about Stuart. So the exciting thing then is we have a frame now in which to define what the mind is, to align ourselves with our clients so that we help their self-organizing mind focus on both their relationships, because it's a relational process, and their interior processes, identifying where chaos or rigidity are revealing impaired integration, and then systematically, comprehensively, working in a health-based model, promote integration. And ultimately, what's so exciting about this is integration is our view of health. So it helps us clarify what mental health is about. But integration is not something that just stops with the reduction of symptoms. You're not just getting rid of chaos or rigidity. You're actually empowering the individual or the couple or the family or whatever system you're working with to actually allow integration to start cultivating more integration. And as I mentioned earlier, the beautiful thing is that integration, when it's made visible, is kindness and compassion. And when we embrace this cross region, what happens inside of you, what happens in your families, what happens in your society, when we identify that, you can start to tap into ways where you as a mental health professional might find opportunities to help promote integration in your lives. So thank you very much for your attention.
It's the end of the day, so I'll grab the opportunity, and in the name of all of us, I would like to thank you very much for your interesting and challenging presentation, especially for traditional psychotherapies.
Yes.
But you are not done yet.
יונה,
And I would like to...
one second. אני מבקשת, בבקשה, זה נורא מפריע להישאר במקומות עד סוף הסשן הזה. אוקיי?
נכון.
זה גם מאוד לא מנומס ולא נעים.
אני מצטרפת
תודה.
לבקשה. I said you are not done yet because I would like to invite my colleague, Professor Uri Adar,
Yes,
who
please.
is the discussant for this session.
Can you hear me? I'm very grateful for the organizer and for Professor Siegel. Do I pronounce your name properly?
Yes, yes.
For having the opportunity to be here and to listen to these very, very inspiring ideas. I'm particularly taken by the way that you construe the relationship between the mind and the brain. There is a problem here which is not very easily resolvable because I think I share the neurophilosophical assumptions about the fact that everything of the mind is somehow tied up in a very specific way to brain processes, and still there is some essential way in which the mind is not reducible to brain processes. It is not very easy to say how and why, maybe because of emergent feature, the difference between rule-governed and emergent features, maybe because of some other reasons. I would have liked to understand more about this, but I think the basic assertion that this is a situation, this is a kind of relationship that exists between the mind and the brain is something that I cohere with very much. Another thing that was inspiring for me was the need to find a way of translating between objective processes formulated usually in one language and subjective experience, which is usually formulated in a different language, and that there is a gain to be made from translating between those two languages that are often quite incompatible with one another in the way that we experience them in daily life. Even I speak in one language about the way that I manage to go to the cashier in the bank and do certain operation, and it's a different language that I use in order to describe how I managed to pacify my daughter when she was very anxious. Okay, so it's very different languages, and I think there is a great importance in trying to be able to either translate, even perhaps create a singular or a language to deal with both of those. And the last things that I want to comment that I found inspiring is similar in structure, but refers to a different domain of knowledge, and that is being able to speak about the body, about bodily experience, or the body generally, even about anatomy, in the same language as we speak, or in similar language, in translatable languages between those and of interpersonal relations. And this is because well, you can formulate the reason that we need it in different ways. One is because the brain somehow superimposes cognitive processes upon the representation of the body. So we know that the brain represents the body, and that all the cognitive processes that it does as well is superimposed upon those. So if we have a way of speaking in the same language about both, then this would perhaps promote our understanding of the brain, of brain processes. So these are things that I really share with you, and I just want to do my job as a discussant by commenting about things that I find problematic. Okay, I hope this is in line with what I'm supposed to do.
Absolutely. Oh, yes, that's enough about that. No.
Right,
yeah.
right.
But it sounds good to me.
Right. So one thing is there are many theories about brain processes on the macro level. There is a lot of agreement about micro level processes, a lot of controversy about macro level processes. So what I miss when I hear about fitting brain processes with theories of experience, of subjective experience of mind, on a macro level is what theories does it exclude? It's a kind of a Popperian point, in the sense that since there is controversy, take a position. What is the so there is a little bit of a position in what you said about left-right differences, cortical differences, because of course not everybody agrees that these hold. But I would want to know what kind of processes, of what kind of theories about macro integration of neural processes are excluded by your own theory. So this is one thing. But I think this is even more so when you approach psychotherapy. There are many theories of psychotherapy. There is a major debate between, let's say, cognitive behavioral therapy and psychoanalytic therapies. Mindfulness is yet a third approach to how therapy should be done. It's very different, for instance, from the kind of therapy that psychoanalysis offers, in which there is a lot of more negative stuff, a lot uglier stuff, a lot of guts and blood, in the way that we talk about experience. So it's different. So I would want to, for instance, to understand. Suppose I wanted to fit a psychoanalytic approach to therapy with brain processes. Would it look different from the way that you fit mindfulness therapy with brain processes? And similarly, for instance, as far as macro integration of brain processes is concerned, in relation to psychotherapy, because I believe that meaning making and the influencing the way that we ascribe meaning to life events is the major things that happens in therapy. That's because of my approach, of course. It's different from some other approaches. Then the relevant related circuits are those that are related to meaning making, usually cortical. And I think in this, it impresses me that the distinction between ventral and dorsal streams, I've only just started, between ventral and dorsal streams are crucial, and the representation of self versus the representation of other or theory of mind. Mm-hmm. So these two circuits I would address those when I try to theorize about psychotherapy in terms of brain processes. But so I'll quickly say my other point, my last point, and that is, on the whole, it seems to me, and in my experience, experience of both brain research and doing psychotherapy, that when we focus on subjective experience, the language, natural language, the way that people talk, is many times richer, has a much higher resolution than the language that is available for us to address those issues, but in terms of brain processes. So we have a very rich language of subjective experience using natural languages, and we have a relatively reduced language to address those in terms of brain processes. So it seems to me that because of this basic situation, the language of experience or the theory of psychotherapy can inform brain research, but not the other way around. Right? So this is my third point.
Sorry for being rigid.
No, no. I think I have this. Wow, so many wonderful questions. We could make a 2-day response to all those questions. Let me try to respond to each of those points and try to make them relevant for all of you for psychotherapy. And please help me if I don't get them in order, and we can make this a back and forth. So the first question is about the views of neuroscience and the views of mind, let's say in psychoanalysis or psychotherapy, and how are there theories of neuroscience that we should eliminate or whatever like that. I think it's very important for all of us as therapists to realize that no one on the planet, not a single scientist or anyone, has illuminated how physical matter, like neurons and their electrons and chemicals and all that stuff, and subjective experience of what we're putting under the term mind, co-create each other. And I'm saying it in that controversial way on purpose. Because the usual thing is to say, well, matter is creating mind, in the sense that these neurons firing are doing that way. And the classic view from science is, if you have a tumor over here, or actually on this side, you can't speak anymore. Therefore, speaking is coming out of here. Or if you have some problem here, you can't remember autobiographical memory or something like that. So it's very understandable for the last 130 years why neurologists said, there's a mental function assigned to locations. And then as that theory had to expand because we realized it wasn't localized, it was actually distributed, that was a huge revolution in terms of the localization theory. Then there was a theory in neuroscience that said after childhood, the brain doesn't change in its growth. That turns out not to be true. So we have to be very humble from the neuroscience point of view that the theories that are proposed, first of all, don't explain at all how subjective experience and brain co-create each other. Zero. We have no idea. No one knows. And there aren't even any theories that really make much sense. No one knows. Even if you say, well, it's the level of the microtubules, which some people are saying, what does that mean? It's the level of, well, how does that happen? So I was talking to a philosopher named Michel Bitball at this monastery we were staying at for a week. And Michel's also trained in physics and philosophy. And basically, he came up with a beautiful thing, which we both were discussing how this would go over in the field of mental health. But there are these things called primes. A prime is just something that's not reducible. So rather than get at this hard problem, which is how in the world does matter create mind or subjective experience, his suggestion, which I'm really hoping is not a cop-out, is just to say there's a prime. Somehow, energy and information flow has a quality to it that's called subjective experience, and stop worrying about it. Now, if you stop worrying about that, then you come to your other questions. You say, well, is there anything, let's say, about, the brain that we should really know about as psychotherapists? Shouldn't it be just mind science informing brain science? And I think they go both ways. And let me give you one example. A friend of mine who recently passed away was a psychoanalyst, and he said the same thing. He said, psychoanalysis has made it clear there's nothing in the brain that's helpful. And so I told him the following story. I said, I had a friend who was being analyzed, and she was then leaving town because she was going to a different program, and the analyst got very angry at her for not disclosing her child sexual abuse before she was just about to leave town. And he was really, really upset with her. I didn't think that was too analytic a move for him, but whatever. So I said, well, to my friend, I said, do you know about the hippocampus? She said, well, what do you mean? And so I described, this is a long time ago, I described what we were learning in the 80s about how the hippocampus allows implicit memory to be embedded into explicit factual memory on the left and autobiographical memory on the right. And when implicit memory is laid down during a trauma, I told her as a hypothesis, the hippocampus is blocked because of a cortisol secretion, which has been shown to block hippocampal functioning, and divided attention, which blocks the hippocampal functioning, and adrenaline, which is also secreted during a trauma, increases implicit encoding. And when an implicit memory is encoded and not integrated by the hippocampus, when it's retrieved into consciousness, it doesn't have a feeling of coming from the past. This is pure neuroscience. So I said to my friend, I said, so you were just having implicit-only retrieval, and you couldn't have known what it was, and then you figured it out, and so you told I said, go tell your analyst that, which she did, and it was very helpful for her, anyway, to empower her. So I told this friend of mine, I said, if I didn't know about the hippocampus from neuroscience, I wouldn't have known from what my supervisors were telling me to do about actually what to do to help people who were traumatized. I knew I needed to recruit the hippocampus by developing a state of trust, which activates a social engagement system, which then I can activate the hippocampus with attention, and then with focal attention, allow these implicit memories to be metabolized in a way, literally in the brain, where they now are integrated into factual form on the left and autobiographical on the right, and then we could then make sense in terms of the making sense process, which is a profoundly bilaterally integrated process. Narratives which draw on autobiographical memory in the right are actually driving from the left push to make sense through the linear telling of a sequence of events, which is what a narrative is. So in your comments then about making sense, for me, I myself couldn't make sense of why making sense makes sense unless I knew about the bilateral nature of the brain. So for me, both areas should inform each other.
Thank you very much, Professor Siegel. Thank you, Professor Hadar. Thank you all for being so patient, and toda rabba.